everybody. This is Nicole Sanchez from MAPC. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be recording this webinar and sending out the recording out to all of you. And another housekeeping thing is if you have questions as we go through this webinar, since we have a lot of folks on the call, if you can type them into the Q&A portion of WebEx, then we will have a discussion and questions section at the end of this webinar, and we'll try to get to all of your questions. If we can't get to them on this webinar, we'll try to answer them offline as well. So as we go, just type in questions as they come up, and I'm going to hand it off to Cami to start us off.
Thanks, Nicole. Nicole, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So hopefully that means everyone else can too. If not, let me know. Thank you to Nicole for kicking us off. Welcome, everyone. As Nicole said, I'm Cami. This is Cami Peterson, the Director of Clean Energy at MAPC. And the reason that I had to ask Nicole if she could hear me is because we're actually in quite different places today. I'm at a conference on district energy in Pittsburgh that the International District Energy Association is hosting. So I'm so glad, though, to be able to join everyone, climate zoning, and the local levers that we can use to try to advance our climate goals in general is obviously a very important piece of the work we do at MAPC and something very close to me and that I'm excited about, as is district energy. So stay tuned on that, and we hope to have some resources and possibly a webinar in the future that we can share with you on that important climate tool as well. But for today, let's kick off our work and our discussion on climate zoning. You can go on to the next slide, Nicole. So just as foundational information for those of you who don't know us, we at MAPC are the regional planning agency here in Greater Boston. So we serve the 101 cities and towns that you see here on this map. It's about half the state's population and about 2/3 of the state's jobs. Go on to the next slide, Nicole. And the work that we do in our clean energy department is really, like I mentioned, building that climate toolbox, really helping cities and towns to think about how they can continue to be leaders in this space and advance their goals for climate mitigation and resiliency, and to have the resources, the policies, the financing, the stakeholder engagement, and all the pieces that they need to come together in order to really set and meet really ambitious climate goals to meet the urgency of the climate crisis. And so with that work, we do a lot of work collectively with our cities and towns. We bring them together to find those economies of scale. We work on individual climate and energy planning, including net zero planning, a platform that we launched a little less than 2 years ago. And we work with technical assistance. So we've worked with many of you probably on this webinar to help you around other types of permitting zoning, local and state policy, gas leaks, green communities, grant writing, peak demand, and on and on. So today we'll be really digging in deeper on the zoning side and talking about how those tools might be of help to all of you in your climate planning. Go on to the next slide. So what our work here today is now that we've gotten past the welcome and introduction, is to talk a little bit more about that platform that we've established on net zero planning, some projects that give that context. We'll then dig into what climate zoning can look like. It's a relatively new space of using those local levers in that way to explicitly advance climate goals. So, what are we talking about? What can that look like? What are some ideas we have? And we'll talk specifically about some work we've been doing with the City of Somerville as part of an EEA Energy and Environmental Affairs Office grant that we received to work on this piece and that we're now looking to disseminate and share with the rest of you. And then we'll be joined by Kai Palmer-Dunning from MEEP, Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership, to speak to some of the research they've done on Somerville's zoning overhaul, as well as they've been looking at green zoning in many other jurisdictions. So they'll share some of an upcoming report with you all, and then hopefully we'll have time for discussion and chat. So let's get to it and go on to the next slide. So our net zero planning here at MAPC, can go on to the next slide. Really, as Nicole, I think mentioned, or as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we really kicked off this work, really started to build our platform on net zero planning a little less than 2 years ago. So it was the fall of 2017 where we had our initial forum to kick off that work, to really launch our net zero resources. Hopefully many of you were in attendance and have been following the work since then as we've been building out the resources and the web platform and the tools to help communities, cities and towns and regions and the state to do this. Some of the ways that we've done that is to help give support on and tools to build better greenhouse gas inventories and do the accounting that's needed to understand how our sectors are contributing to our greenhouse gas footprints. We've also looked at net zero planning at a community level, done a lot of research on what other cities and towns and states and provinces are doing in this country and around the world to provide some examples for that, and are using that and the strategies in multiple different clean energy and climate practices to build a municipal net zero playbook. So that's under development, though there are pieces of it already that you can find on our web platform, and we'll be building that over the next year plus, and that will feed as well into our regional plan update, which is Metro Common 2050. So as we look as a regional agency at the future through 2050, our vision for our region, we want that to be a net zero region, and we want to help provide the playbook to help get our cities and towns there. So hopefully that will inform our vision, and our vision for the region will inform the resources we're able to put together. Go on to the next slide, Nicole. And just to explain a little bit more about what we mean in terms of net zero planning, we really see that as a holistic framework. It's focused on the benefits of carbon mitigation. It's focused on that goal of needing to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to, a zero net carbon place by 2050, if not earlier. But we see it as a place, an opportunity to really expand and improve livelihoods and landscapes and equity throughout our region in many ways. So it's not just a question of clean energy. It's not even just a question of your typical greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. It's really understanding the economic impacts that can have, the benefits that we can get from the cost savings, from monetizing and quantifying externalities and other pieces in the way that we should be doing in order to fully account for those, understanding the workforce development and the opportunities that come with that, the ecological and resiliency needs and benefits that are in the net zero space, obvious public health benefits that really come from cleaning up our air and water and continuing to clean up our greenhouse gas emissions, and the opportunities to really make all of these benefits and all of this progress much more equitable. We have the chance to anyway have much more of a clean slate as we rebuild a lot of our infrastructure and our systems, and it really does need to be a full systems type of work. And so the opportunity is great, and we need to take advantage of the chance to creating a much more equitable access and opportunity in our energy, environment, economic, public health, and so on spaces. Transportation, something not mentioned here, but a piece of all of this, and that could certainly be a bubble as well. So that's the holistic framework that we see as part of the net zero vision we want to advance. You can move on to the next slide, Nicole. The process we see at a very high level really requires kind of thinking across your community. So it's recruiting support and making sure you engage and listen to feedback and input from stakeholders, many different types of stakeholders throughout your community. It's also making sure you set goals and pursue those goals, come up with the strategies that are needed to really meet those goals and exceed them, hopefully, that you really are thinking holistically, and that you're gathering the necessary information, the facts, the science, the data to support that, and being willing to then adjust as that changes. Every forecast that comes out from the UN on climate change is different, a couple of years later. They can't obviously predict everything exactly. And so they forecasted the best they can, but as things change, as positive feedback loops with climate take place, we have to update that information and be able to adapt our strategies and strengthen them or change them or do what's necessary to really fit that moment. You can go on to the next slide. So just to talk to you about what do we mean by net zero. There's a lot of definitions out there. We really are focusing not just on net zero energy, which is a piece of it, or zero energy when that's possible, but net zero carbon. And thinking about all these bubbles that you see here. This is the full ecosystem of what we see as getting to net zero. So you can go ahead and advance the slide, Nicole. In those different definitions, and we'll put up a couple here, not all of them touch on all of these pieces all the time. You can go on to the next one. Many of them touch on at least some of them or close to all of them. It really depends. Are they focusing on buildings or a certain sector or where they're starting? You can go on to the next one. And that's not to say that any of them are less good or less right in what they're doing. It's where they're kind of starting, and it's very important to carve out what you are describing or defining when your community, your entity, your organization, your government sets forth a net zero or carbon neutral or carbon free type of policy. What sectors, what areas are you including? But ultimately, we hope to get to all of these bubbles and to include them all in order to reach the future that we need, that fully holistic framework that would get us there. So this one of the definitions we're showing you today probably comes the closest, because I think the way that MAPC looks at it is that we really do need to reduce the climate damaging emissions as much as possible and wherever possible and keep adapting to improve that. But those remaining emissions, right here it has one option of netting those out through purchase of carbon offsets. That is an option, but whether that includes purchasing renewable energy credits, it's not always included in how people define carbon offsets per se, but that can be a part of the puzzle. And certainly planting trees, using soils, using green infrastructure to sequester carbon. There are many ways that we can find to kind of balance out our net zero equation. You can go on to the next slide. We've put together that web platform that I mentioned. This is it, so feel free to check it out after this, and it'll continue to improve and have things added to it as we continue building our resources and our municipal net zero playbook. On to the next slide, Nicole, and this is where I'm going to turn it over to Nicole so she can dig in more deeply, tell you about the survey we're doing, and then really get into what our climate zoning is. Thanks.
Thanks, Cami. I wanted to give a quick sneak peek of a survey that we're doing under the next round of the EA grant. And so this webinar today and the topic of climate zoning is something that we've been working on through the round that is wrapping up this month. And so in the next round of the program, we're working with 3 communities on net zero planning, and we wanted to hear from all of you about what your municipalities have been doing, even if you're not calling it net zero, but using a different definition like the ones that we talked about, where you might be setting community targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially where you've been most successful. And this is a great opportunity to brag to us about some of your innovations and achievements. So we'll be sending out this survey soon. Look out for an email this week. And it's a pretty short survey just about your targets. And the whole purpose is to see what you're working on. And this is will lead to a couple of short follow-up calls if you'd opt into that. And then we're looking to talk to you about those innovations, both to highlight you in our clean energy newsletters, but also to see where we can make some more net zero case studies. So we're really looking for any efforts that you've made that other communities might want to hear about. I think the case studies are a great way to see what's out there, and especially as we're talking about zoning, a lot of zoning updates that we make take a little while to get into the internet and be searchable there. So we really want to hear directly from you on what you're working on. So now I want to talk about what could climate zoning look like. And again, this is something that's come out of this round of the EA project, where we're working with Somerville and Wayland. So when we think about climate zoning and where that fits in, we have to think about what types of things we can put under zoning and where we can look to achieve some of our greenhouse gas mitigation targets in our zoning bylaws and ordinances. So some of the ways that this could look like are setback exemptions for insulation. So if you're trying to have more buildings that are meeting passive house standards, thinking about how you can allow that extra insulation, I use the word extra, but the insulation that we need to meet passive house on a building where you may not have been planning for that before through your zoning. Allowing energy efficient technology by right. So we've talked a lot about solar zoning and how we can make, what types of solar systems we can make allowable by right. Here we're making that a broader category and thinking about wind, air source heat pumps, and other technology that can help us with that greenhouse gas mitigation. Thinking about special permits and plan reviews as potential tools to have a more in-depth review of that energy reduction or greenhouse gas mitigation in new buildings or large retrofits. And then thinking about different multi-pathway building standards that already exist that we can implement into zoning. One other way that climate zoning could look like is doing a climate overlay, so setting a zone of your city or town that has particular requirements and a pathway to achieve that target that you've set, or the priority, even if it's not a formalized target. And then considering where we're citing public and shared infrastructure. So one consideration when we're thinking about climate zoning is to think about what building standards we want to pull from. So we have a couple of standards here. This is not an exhaustive list, but the main things that you're looking for are a building standard that has similar priorities to what your municipal target is, and also has different pathways to achieve that target. So we have LEED, which I know probably all of you are familiar with, and we have, so you could set a requirement for buildings to be LEED certifiable, for example, and so you can look at the different levels of LEED and see which ones overlap with your priorities and your target. Another standard to look at is WELL, and so that is structured to pair with LEED, and WELL focuses a lot on the things that Cami was talking about under our holistic planning framework. So WELL is really looking at the experience inside those buildings and some of the public health concerns and addressing those directly. We also have Passive House, which is really focused on the building envelope, and some of these harder to reach areas in terms of new buildings or building retrofits. So if we're going to focus on the envelope, it's a lot easier to make a building net zero ready. So Passive House is a really good consideration for larger structures or new construction. And then we have Architecture 2030, which is a different standard that's approaching net zero. So having that pathway that's focused on greenhouse gas emissions, but is taking a slightly different approach than Passive House. So there are other standards that are out there, but it's worth looking at which standard or standards make sense with your community's target. The other important thing is that there's a lot of overlap between a resilient building and a net zero building. And when we're talking about climate zoning, we're not only hyper-focused on greenhouse gas emissions and reducing those, we're also thinking about where vulnerable communities are and where some of our climate adaptation measures need to take place and trying to overlap those two. So if you have a house or building that's meeting Passive House standards, you're also making a structure that's more resilient because if you have a better envelope, that building can stay at temperature for longer without, if there's an energy outage. But we're also thinking about things like raising equipment to prepare buildings in case of flooding. And we also have some recommendations for zoning where we're thinking about how to manage stormwater. So we're trying to overlay all these different concerns into our zoning and see where they can intersect and where these different needs can benefit each other. So I want to give a couple of examples of, in a little bit more detail, of what this could look like. So one example of climate zoning are green codes. And so Seattle has a great example with their green factor. And so this is a multi-pathway checklist that new buildings over a certain size have to fill out while they're going through permitting. And so this has a lot of climate adaptation measures built in, and so developers can choose which types of native plants they want to add to their project, for example. And so they go through this checklist and select all the different elements that they're planning to add to the project and come up with a green score. And so the requirement is that the score needs to be over a certain amount. And there are a couple other examples of this, so that's worth looking into, potentially setting up something like this to give different options to developers, but still be requiring that they're meeting the same objectives that you're aiming for. The other big thing that I don't want to go without mentioning is equity considerations for climate zoning. So we're thinking about resiliency and greenhouse gas mitigation. We also want to be thinking about where our vulnerable populations are and how they would be affected. So I have some questions you can ask to make sure that you're considering this as you're looking at your zoning maps. So thinking about where urban heat islanding effects are concentrated and flooding risks, where you already have resilient infrastructure, where do your vulnerable populations live, and then thinking about the planning and engagement process for new zoning language, thinking about where there are barriers to building renovations, and especially where there might be a risk of displacement if you take certain measures or add requirements to zoning but don't add protections along with those. And then thinking about how you can engage environmental justice communities and populations that may be most affected or that you don't hear from often on through your usual process. So thinking of how you can reach out to more folks that you don't usually hear from. So now I have two local examples. So Watertown passed a new section of their zoning for solar, and so they have their section 8.05 and 9.03A, and they have this updated solar requirement. So this requires for projects that are over 10,000 square feet or 10 or more residential units to include a solar energy system that's 50% of the roof area or 90% of uncovered area of parking structures. So this is a pretty innovative zoning measure and a good place to look to for solar zoning. And Watertown is really the first to make this a requirement and not go for solar ready. And solar ready is now in the building code. So this is an interesting way to push the envelope with zoning. And then Somerville we've been working with through the EA project on to provide some zoning recommendations to them. And part of the reason of the timing of this is that they're in the process of working on a zoning overhaul. And so this is the website where you can learn more about that process. They're switching over to a form-based code, and they've also included some a green code that they've based on some green codes that they've looked at from other communities. So those are really interesting sections of this proposed code that you can find on this website. And so because of the timing of this zoning overhaul, we have been working with Somerville to provide a little bit of research and some recommendations on where they could potentially go even further on their zoning. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the recommendations that we came up with from our research that we've proposed to Somerville to either include in this zoning overhaul or to consider for after this overhaul goes through. So one of these is ultra-low emissions building systems and allowing those by right. So the purpose of this language is to kind of future-proof your zoning, right? So we could go about zoning for new greenhouse gas emissions mitigation technology by waiting for it to come out and then writing in definitions for each of those technologies and then adopting new zoning language as that happens, which is pretty much the approach we've been taking for solar so far, but that's not really in line with the pace of when those technologies come out. So instead of focusing on what that individual technology is, creating a category that those fit under and defining what types of things would and what types of systems we want to promote in our cities and towns, and then accepting those by right. And so this, you could have limitations based on size or different zones if you don't want this to be city or town wide. But the idea here is to include things like solar PV, to allow for community shared solar and solar thermal, and then also small wind or hydro equipment for air source heat pumps and energy storage. So because those technologies are developing faster than we can really keep up with zoning, setting the objectives that we want to see and then working backwards from there. So the second recommendation we had is for an eco roof requirement, and this is another way that we can utilize our roofs, but also give some flexibility to developers on how they want to meet this requirement. And so the eco roof definition covers all of these different systems, and so the requirement would be for new construction especially to utilize one of these types of roofs to be helping to meet that target, but giving the flexibility to choose so that they can decide which one of these options fits best for that building. Because we know that not every building is oriented or set up correctly for PV or solar thermal. There are other options here. So this also includes green roofs, so roofs with living green infrastructure, and those can address urban heat islanding or water storage or air quality. A white or cool roof, so this is a roof that has a surface that's reflecting heat as opposed to absorbing it, and that's primarily for mitigating urban heat islanding effect as well. A blue roof is the roof that's managing stormwater, and so that could be collecting water, or that could be combined with a green roof, so having plants that be absorbing that water, or just being able to move water from the roof in a more strategic way. And then the third thing that I'm going to talk about today is a climate overlay zone. So we're really thinking how can we focus on particular zones within the community and set a pathway for compliance that would be a little bit beyond the requirements of LEED or some of the other building standards, but would still preserve the flexibility of having different pathways. And if we wanted to really match the target with what we're asking for in zoning, what categories would we look at? So here, our suggestion would be to look at these four, so building, transportation, energy source, and open space and landscape, because those are addressing the main sectors where we see greenhouse gas emissions. And so you can pull out a couple of the examples of what this looks like. So in buildings, thinking about passive house standards, allowing accessory dwelling units by right, so that's also addressing some of the equity concerns. And in transportation, one of the more out there ideas would be to deploy a car-free zone, but there are different options for this. So installing protected bike and walking infrastructure is a little bit less of a reach for that goal under transportation. And then thinking about climate paving, so where your impervious surfaces are. And then for energy source, thinking about the infrastructure that we already have and the infrastructure that we'd like to have for things like district heating and cooling, allowing and community shared solar by right, and then requiring electrification of new buildings is a big one that could be a good reach in that area. And then for open space and landscape, again, thinking about stormwater management in roofs and in parks, and then thinking about a green area ratio, so that's similar to the green code. That's the same idea there. And then thinking about multi-use civic space, so where we can have different uses in the same spot. So those are the three of the recommendations that we gave to Somerville through this project. I'm going to hand it over to Kai from NEEP, who's going to tell us about some of the work that they've been doing and some other case studies, and he's going to talk about Somerville in a little bit more detail too.
Thank you, Nicole. You can go to the next slide. Again, my name is Kai Plummer-Dunning. I'm the Buildings and Communities Associate here at NEEP. And a little bit of background on NEEP. NEEP is Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships is one of 6 regional energy efficiency organizations that's funded by the DOE. And so we provide support and local efficiency policies to states in our region. Next slide. And so NEEP's region is we cover 13 states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And so we provide, again, we provide technical assistance and resources to states, communities, and other stakeholders. And we also work with organizations, energy efficiency organizations, and environmental organizations like MAPC around codes, technologies, and other market transforming pathways to get to our climate goals. Next slide. And so one of the resources that we're developing is a green zoning or climate zoning report. And kind of the impetus for that is our work, one of the work that we do in Massachusetts is around codes and figuring out how we can get Massachusetts to rapidly achieve zero energy. But one of the things that we found was that communities that passed climate action plans to address energy efficiency and sustainability on the local level, they often, in terms of mitigating energy from buildings, they often ran into the building codes, the state building codes, which are minimum floor, but so buildings can be built past the code. But on like a municipal level, they can't require that buildings reach a certain level of efficiency past the code. Next slide. And so again, one of the precursors for any type of climate zoning is to develop a climate action plan. And a lot of communities have done this in Massachusetts and then in other regions. And the goal of the climate action plan is really to set local sustainability and energy goals to identify areas of focus in terms of their climate impact and to outline the strategies for achieving goals in each area. And so specifically for the goal of achieving energy efficiency and sustainability for buildings, climate zoning is the pathway to do that. All right, next slide. And so I'm going to go through a couple of case studies that are from the report to kind of really show how climate zoning strategies are being used at the local level to really drive energy efficiency and sustainability and resiliency. Next slide. So first is Northampton. So Northampton actually they started their climate action planning process in 2005, and then over the next 7 years or so, they realized that they would need to rezone in order. They realized that their current zoning doesn't really help with really mitigating the environmental impact of buildings, so they decided to rezone. And so one of the things that they employed with their rezone was to have an urban residential sustainable growth overlay district. And so this overlay district, it covers about half an acre, and it applies to single-family, multifamily, and townhouses. And buildings built within this overlay district need to meet one of two requirements. They can either achieve a HERS rating of 47 or lower for buildings that are 1,200 square feet or less, or a HERS rating of 41 or lower for buildings larger than 21 square feet, or they can achieve LEED Gold for new construction or LEED Gold for neighborhood development. And then for communities, this is more of an aside, and so then for communities that don't necessarily want to have requirements for LEED, another pathway is to use a density bonus, which offers incentives to developers to meet like LEED certification requirements for higher density allowances, because oftentimes certain zones have a floor to area ratio that can't be exceeded. And then density bonuses can also be used to incentivize affordability, which lends itself to the equity portion of climate zoning that Nicole was talking about earlier. Next slide. And then Nicole talked about Somerville a little bit, but I want to kind of go into one portion of the overhaul that they're doing for their zoning. So similar to Seattle with their green factor, Somerville decided to proposed to employ a green score, which is performance-based environmental landscape standard that's based around like a weighted point system, and it incentivizes landscape and site design elements that address and reduce stormwater runoff, improve urban air quality. They mitigate urban heat island effect, and improve overall well-being of residents and visitors. And so, also similar to the green factor for Seattle, the different strategies and site design and landscape features that lend themselves to one of these areas, one of these elements, are given a number of points, and then those points are added up to achieve a score that's calibrated to the building type, and each building type needs to meet that minimum score. All right, next slide. And then so also another case study is from Denver, Colorado. So Denver is in the process of passing a green building ordinance. And it offers a flexible pathway for compliance. So for new buildings that are 25,000 square feet or up, in additions that are 50,000 square feet, they're required to have a cool roof. Again, Nicole touched on this earlier, but cool roofs definitely mitigate a heat island effect, and in urban centers like Denver, that's a huge benefit, because heat island effects can often, during daytime hours, heat island effects can often lead to temperatures that are up to 5 degrees higher, and at night up to 21 degrees higher. And having to account for that can have a huge energy impact in terms of cooling. And then in addition to the cool roof requirement, buildings need to achieve one of the following. So they need to pay into a green building fund. They need to have on-site solar, and then for buildings that can't achieve on-site solar, because oftentimes on-site solar, it can't be achieved for buildings past a certain height, or certain load, being able to like purchase off-site solar energy is another option. And then, unlike Massachusetts, I guess in Colorado, Denver can go above the code. So another option is energy conservation that's at least 12% above code requirements. And then finally, there's the green building to achieve a green building certification. So LEED or Passive House or another certification that can lend itself to energy efficiency. All right, next slide. And so then there are other pathways through zoning that can be used to address energy and sustainability and resiliency. So a couple of these are like being able to specify the orientation of the building to maximize daylighting, which allows for buildings to not be able to use lighting energy during the day. And then to require covered parking in commercial districts, which reduce heat island effect from the asphalt. And then also requiring a minimum solar reflectance index on roofs of commercial and industrial districts. And then being able to exempt overhangs and exterior wall thickness, counting towards the gross square footage, if that thickness or overhang contributes to a tighter building envelope or energy efficiency. So this also goes back towards that Florida area ratio. So if being able to subtract that thickness or overhang from that Florida area ratio can help that building meet the zoning requirements. And then finally, building fenestration standards, which promote passive solar benefits to the building as well. Next slide. Yeah, and so the report, with the report, once it's published, it will be disseminated on our website, and our information can be shared with the stakeholders on this call. And then following the report, our vision is to create some sort of a shopping list of different zoning strategies that can be calibrated and used by communities based off of their specifications and their identities and contexts. Because oftentimes, there isn't like a one-size-fits-all for zoning, and different strategies are required in order to kind of achieve efficiency for a specific community. Sorry, thank you.
Thanks, Kai. We have your information at the last slide as well. We're gonna move to the question and answer section based on some of the questions that you've typed in, and if you have questions that you've been mulling over but haven't gotten a chance to type in yet, please do so. And we do have a couple of questions already, and so one of them was asking about what by right zoning means, and so I can explain that in a little bit more detail. So when we're talking about by right zoning, we're really thinking about often in the use table of your zoning ordinance or bylaw, for different uses, a city or town would designate which zones those are allowable in. And so if you say that it's allowable by right, that's a much faster approval process. So that's saying that it doesn't need to go through a zoning review. Other designations for different uses would be special permit, and so then something would have to go through a special permit review, which involves a little bit more detail and going in front of the planning board often to get that use approved in that zone. And so when we're talking about by right zoning on the broad level, that doesn't mean that you need to allow that technology by right in every zone. You could choose which areas are most appropriate. So if we're using solar as an example, you might want to allow that in your residential zones by right, and then have bigger review process for commercial, for example. So you can do a little bit more fine-tuning within that, but we're talking about ideally, in a perfect world, having some of these things allowable by right so that folks can have an easier time putting in place the technology or the building systems that we want and are encouraging them to do otherwise.
Yeah, and this is Cammie, and Nicole, just to add to that, I think that was very clear and very helpful. But I just wanted to remind folks, too, for those of you who are familiar with the Green Communities Program and the 5 criteria that are required in order to become designated, the first one of those that deals with the zoning around renewables, it can be a solar overlay by right. It can be around renewable manufacturing or around research and development and zoning for those all by right. And so there's a really strong precedent in the way that we've been, as a state, facilitating renewables and improving that, because the time for developer, for building owner, and others that it takes to go through that longer process, really there is an opportunity cost to that. So it is a big benefit to have that by right aspect there. I also wanted to just address a number of questions that we've gotten around building code and BBRS and kind of where that line is. And it's not something that we can give you a legal opinion on or a definitive opinion, but the way that I think is best to think about it generally is that building code, the state building code, which is uniform across the state, unless you opt up into the stretch energy code, which again is one of the criteria really for green communities. So it's about 250 of our cities and towns now that have opted up to that stretch energy code, but that too is uniform for those communities. That really governs energy in buildings. So you would say, well, a lot of what you're talking about today is energy in buildings. So how can we do any of this through zoning? And it really comes down to a distinction between whether you're requiring certain things in terms of energy efficiency or renewables, or whether, in most cases, and again, this is not a legal opinion, or whether it's kind of considered somewhat more optional or is one pathway to meet a standard but is not the only pathway, or is dealing more with greenhouse gas emissions and climate mitigation, carbon mitigation, rather than with energy. So if the way that you're structuring your zoning is focused on climate mitigation, and certain pathways to achieve that could be through energy reductions or energy conservation or renewable energy or the like, that is less likely to come into conflict with the building code than something explicitly meant to affect energy. Where there has been some fuzziness around this, and one of the questions was around towns and cities and even LEED being adopted. There are a number of cities that in the Commonwealth that have had LEED as part of their zoning for a number of years and have gone with the ability to do that. Towns have at times run into issues with that, since the Attorney General does review all town zoning, and it's not the case for cities. Generally, I think it still has been understood that while it's not flat law, and again, no legal opinion, where LEED is has a better chance of being permissive, is that LEED is focus on a number of ways to meet that standard. So many of those are energy-related pathways, but many are not. There's things to get points in LEED that putting in showers near a bike room, and things connected to bike and pedestrian infrastructure, and things connected to green infrastructure. So there are a number of ways that are not energy-specific that are part of meeting compliance with LEED, and so that has generally been understood in practice, in most cases, to have been outside of that. Again, it's not a legal opinion, and has not been the case every time. So there is no exact yes or no, black or white way of thinking about this, but we do know that there is more that we can do through our zoning to address climate change, and that in some cases we're going to have to try to figure out the different ways that we can do that, and really focusing that again on our greenhouse gas mitigation priorities and commitments is the best way to frame in our minds how to add that into your local policy. I'll turn it back to you, Nicole, for the next questions that have come in.
Yeah, so we have a couple other questions come in. One is about if we have language on special permit climate standards. We haven't written out sample language yet, but we do have a little bit, our recommendations in a little bit more detail, and we're planning to have that as an additional resource on our net zero site that we gave you the link for before. So that's a good place to stay tuned on resources like that. We also got a question on allowing the purchase of carbon offsets and what that would look like. Like, is that, if you're going to allow that, would that look like specific RECs, or could you like specify what that looks like?
Yeah, I think that's a place where there's many different definitions out there. At the conference I'm at currently in Pittsburgh on district energy, there was a presentation I attended yesterday with reference to carbon, saying, I think it was actually for Princeton University, they have many commitments that they've made, pretty ambitious goals, but they're not being allowed in meaning, I think it's by 2046, they have to be carbon neutral as a campus, and that's like the 300th anniversary of their university, and they're not allowing carbon offsets. But then he specified that didn't include purchasing RECs. So the way that they were defining carbon offsets were that they would pay for trees to be planted somewhere else, and that they weren't going to be allowed, per what the university had decided to do that. So that was how they were defining it. I think there are a number of different jurisdictions that have recognized that right now, that when we look at our building sector, there's certainly going to be buildings, especially if we look at a per building basis rather than a sectoral basis. There are going to be buildings that cannot reach a net zero or zero energy status on their own. And so, they're just not suitable for renewables, after they get the envelope as efficient as it possibly can be. Even if they build a passive house, there might still be some residual emissions they need to offset. And they might not be able, for whatever reason, to put on-site renewables. And so that, by purchasing, in our case, I would definitely recommend Mass Class 1 renewable energy credits. Then you're at least, still having a really strong impact and can potentially net out those emissions for now, and then hopefully move to a place where you can get to, doing it all on site. But really it depends on, who's defining it and what definition that jurisdiction determines or decides to use at that time. Oh, and like I mentioned before, sorry to go on, but the best way I think of offsetting that residual, those residual emissions are through other means that you do have at your disposal on site. Beyond the renewables, you certainly can look at things that we showed in some of our slides on green roofs and blue roofs and white roofs, and where you're absorbing carbon, trees and other green infrastructure. There's a lot being done right now, studies on soil management and how you can sequester carbon in that way. So there's a lot of ways to kind of look at how we net out what emissions we don't get that's just through efficiency or renewables. And
so we only have a few minutes left, so I have one more question that I want to pose, which is someone asked if we could go into more detail about what requiring electrification would look like for new buildings. And I do want to quickly mention, because someone else asked where the presentation will be posted, and yes, we will be posting the recording and the slides from this webinar on the website, and we'll also be sending it out to all of you. And I'm just going to switch to this slide if you want to write down any of our contact information to reach out to us with more questions if we haven't been able to address them during this webinar.
Yeah, and just to get to the electrification question, I think, again, that it really depends on the jurisdiction, how they want to set that up. I think there are ways to say that you could require all new construction or major renovations to not have any fossil energy used in the building. So, no on-site fossil heat or, combustion of energy for heating. And so, or I've heard of some jurisdictions setting things up in that way. I think New York City is trying to move in that direction. So if you think about ways that you can frame it to kind of get to the ends that you want while still providing flexibility. Most jurisdictions in zoning or other kinds of local policies have strayed away from necessarily specifying a certain type of technology that you need to use. There's air source heat pumps, there's ground source heat pumps, there's there's ways of having renewable-based district energy. Since again I'm at that conference, so I'll pitch that for a moment too. So thinking beyond, but I think generally the mission of requiring electrification or having kind of new buildings and major renovations follow a prescription for electrification would be to get out the fossil combustion from those buildings, and that can be met in many different ways.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I just off the top of my head, I guess I can think of maybe also using like a density bonus for electrification. So instead of using a building using fossil fuels, they can reach a higher density if they use technologies that achieve 100% electrification.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Kai. There's a lot of other kind of ways through permitting, through things like FAR, the floor area ratio, through setbacks, through different kinds of insulation or passive house different standards that you're setting, local kind of levers that many of you have the power to think about administering that can help get to a more electrified building sector or one that's really focused more on using renewables and energy efficiency and many of these other greenhouse gas emitting reduction kind of strategies.
Thanks. So I know there are probably more questions that will come in later, but we are at time. So please reach out to us if you have more questions that we haven't been able to address today. And thank you so much for logging in today to have this conversation with us about climate zoning. We're really excited about this work, and we look forward to putting some more resources on our site and to seeing the report that NEEP is coming out with soon.
Yeah, Nicole, I'll just add before we sign off, this is really the beginning of the conversation. We're excited, as Nicole said, to kind of see where this work can lead us. There are still a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty in this space. We want to also be advancing the building codes. All those questions were really well fit for this discussion. There are many different kind of levers that we can try to pull to improve our building stock and to use them as the best tools in our fight for climate change. So I encourage you all to keep those questions, to think about how we can advance both the building code, zoning, and the many other levers we have at our disposal. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.